I think when I look at like the work I do professionally in the climate sector and in kind of intersection in climate and housing, we also see the influence of corporate interests there. Like, for example, when there are new development standards to reduce emissions in buildings, which is another significant source of emissions in the country, there has been repeated incidents of lobbying from, housing developers against new efficiency standards. So, I think when we look at kind of the corporate control, there there has to be a real emphasis on understanding that green capitalism is really in play, that there are a lot of actors willing to capitalize on, okay, fine, like if this climate action stuff is trendy, if this is the direction we're going to go, then how can we still profit the most out of it? What are the ways that our companies can care as much as they can about that kind of profit, that bottom line? So, I think that there's lots to talk about in the nuance of, I guess, in the spectrum of climate action, where corporate control can be. But I really wanted to kind of focus on two main strategies. So, like Leah said, Indigenous solidarity is one kind of key strategy the climate justice movement uses to counter corporate influence, and the other is fossil fuel divestment. So, I think that climate justice movement activists really have to recognize that Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities have faced the worst impacts of the climate crisis and also have been on the front lines of fighting against natural resource extraction. Indigenous Climate Action had a report, Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon, which amplifies how resistance impacts the viability of fossil fuel expansion and and ultimately reduces the carbon in our atmosphere. What that means is activists can have and need to continue supporting Indigenous land defenders. It's not, like, Indigenous land defenders are separate from climate activists, and I think they often get lumped in the same into the same bucket. But I think it's really important to recognize that there's really, really incredible work happening by Indigenous land defenders. And one way to do that kind of solidarity, is to bring attention to some of these resistance actions across the country. So, in 2016, I participated in a civil disobedience on Parliament Hill in Ottawa against the Trans Mountain, formerly Kinder Morgan pipeline. That was bringing it from the West to Ottawa, to Parliament Hill. And that, raises awareness, makes it, is trying to hold governments accountable. More recently, activists have held rallies in downtown Toronto in front of bank headquarters in support of the Wet'suwet'en. So I think that kind of key piece of what does it look like, even if, you feel very far removed from Indigenous land defenders and your local communities, to amplify their work. I think, and then with fossil fuel divestment, I organize with Climate Justice Toronto locally now. But when I started, I was a undergrad student, and I was part of the Queen's University campaign for fossil fuel divestment. Fossil fuel divestment as a whole, as a goal, works because it stigmatizes the fossil fuel industry. It kind of brings awareness of the hypocrisy of banks and of campuses, of all of the greenwashing, and to commitments that, corporations and institutions have towards sustainability and climate action, while actively courting, oil and gas sponsorships and donations and funding fossil fuel projects. So, I think that fossil fuel divestment has been a very effective strategy to start this conversation, to think about what it looks like to reinvest in clean energy, and to get people involved in a way that feels tangible. Because, tackling like RBC, the biggest fossil fuel financer in the world, may not feel so tangible for an individual or for a community group.